She laughs at the joke 3 seconds too late, her eyes scanning the room before settling on the speaker's left shoulder. This is not awkwardness. It is a nervous system calculating threat in a body that learned safety through strategic disappearance. She does not know why she cannot feel the room. Only that feeling. It would cost something she stopped paying long ago. The family gathers in the kitchen that smells of reheated coffee and obligations too old to name. Everyone performing a warmth that no one actually feels. The silence between sentences growing like mold in the corners where the cabinets meet the wall. She stands at the counter arranging crackers into a pattern that means nothing. Her hands moving with the precision of someone who has learned that stillness invites attention, and attention has never been safe. Her brother enters with a story about his promotion, his voice too loud for the room. And she watches the others pivot toward him with expressions of interest that arrive before he finishes speaking, their timing rehearsed in childhood. She waits for her cue, the exact moment when her face must shift from neutral to pleased, and she hits it with mechanical accuracy, a smile that reaches her mouth while her eyes remain focused on the cheese knife in her hand. No one notices the disconnection because they are all performing similar calculations, their gazes sliding past each other like magnets reversed, the room filled with people who have learned to be present without being seen. Later, at the restaurant where the lighting is designed to make everyone look healthier than they are, she sits at the end of the table where the acoustics blur conversation into a manageable hum, her position chosen without conscious thought. The waiter asks about her day, and she delivers a response she has used before, the words arriving pre-assembled, while she monitors his reaction for signs that she has said something wrong, something that will require repair. Her partner squeezes her hand under the table, a gesture of solidarity that she feels as pressure rather than comfort, her body interpreting closeness as a demand she does not know how to meet. She watches a woman at the next table laugh with her whole body, the sound unmeasured and therefore terrifying, and she feels something like grief without understanding what has been lost or when she lost it. The check arrives and she calculates the tip with mathematical precision, not because she cares about the money, but because the numbers give her somewhere safe to look while the others negotiate goodbye hugs she cannot feel. In the car, her partner asks if she had a good time, and she says yes with the same timing she used at 6 when her mother asked about school. The lie so practiced it no longer registers as deception. She stares at the highway lines disappearing under the wheels, and wonders why she feels exhausted by an evening that required nothing of her. No real conversation, no genuine exposure, only the maintenance of a surface she cannot remember choosing. The pattern repeats at the office where she arrives early to arrange her desk into a configuration that signals unavailability. The headphones she does not need sitting on her ears like a do not disturb sign written in a language everyone understands. Her colleague leans over the partition with a personal question, and she feels her chest tighten with the familiar calculation of how much truth can be safely extracted from the warehouse of acceptable responses she maintains for exactly these moments. She deflects with a question about the project deadline, watching relief flood his face, because he too prefers the territory of tasks to the dangerous landscape of actual exchange, and they part with the mutual gratitude of two people avoiding the same abyss. In meetings, she speaks only when the momentum of the conversation makes her contribution invisible, her insights arriving wrapped in qualifiers that dissolve before they can be examined, her voice pitched to merge with the ambient noise of productivity. The promotion goes to someone louder, someone who has not learned that visibility attracts correction, and she feels a shame so old it tastes like childhood, mixed with the secret relief that she will not have to perform authority she does not feel. At the gym, she chooses the machine facing the wall, her body moving through repetitions while her mind rehearses conversations that will never happen. Arguments where she finally says the true thing and is not destroyed by the saying. The trainer approaches with encouragement and she nods without breaking rhythm, her smile automatic, her body continuing its mechanical work while some essential part of her retreats to the observation deck where she has lived since she was small. She notices another woman performing the same disappearance, her eyes fixed on the television screen while her body executes the program, and she feels a recognition that does not quite become connection. Two prisoners acknowledging the same invisible bars. The evening stretches before her with its requirement of self-improvement, the book she will read without absorbing, the show she will watch without seeing, the meditation app that guides her through breathing exercises she performs like a penance for existing. She lies in bed reviewing the day's interactions with the precision of a general analyzing a lost battle, cataloging the moments where her timing was off, where someone might have seen the gap between her performance and her presence. The ceiling fan turns above her with a rhythm that should be soothing, but instead marks the passing of another day in which she was not fully anywhere, not at work, not at dinner, not in her own body when her partner reached for her in the dark. She tells herself tomorrow will be different without believing it. The promise as hollow as the ones she makes to friends she will not call back. The maintenance of relationships requiring a currency she stopped earning before she knew she would need it. Sleep comes not as rest, but as escape, her consciousness releasing its grip on the performance with the gratitude of an actor leaving a stage where the audience has long since gone home. In the morning, she will rise and begin again, the mask fitting more snugly with each wearing, her face forgetting the contours it once had when expressions were connected to something inside, rather than calculated for optimal safety. She does not recognize this as trauma, because it does not look like the stories she has been told. No single event to point to, no villain to name, only the slow accumulation of moments where being real was punished, and being absent was not. The recognition will come later, in a moment she cannot yet imagine, when someone sees through the performance with eyes that do not demand anything in return, and the terror of being known will finally make sense as the fear of being known and still being left. Until then, she moves through her life with the grace of someone who has mastered an impossible skill, the art of appearing human while maintaining a distance no one can measure, her survival so complete it has become indistinguishable from death. She does not know that she is waiting, that some part of her has been holding its breath since childhood, preparing for a safety that will not arrive through the same strategies that kept her alive when being alive was dangerous. The pattern continues, invisible to her as water to a fish, until the day she notices herself disappearing from her own story, a spectator in the theater of her life, watching the action from a seat that grows more distant with each scene. This is where the recognition begins, not with understanding, but with the faint suspicion that the exhaustion she carries has a source she has been too busy surviving to name, a cost she has been paying without knowing the currency or the debt. She will trace it back eventually, this art of strategic absence, to rooms where love was conditional and presence was monitored, where the only safety lay in becoming invisible to the very people who were supposed to see her most clearly. The memory will surface not as image but as sensation, the body remembering what the mind has protected her from knowing, the tightness in her chest that arrives with intimacy, the relief that follows its withdrawal. For now, she continues her rounds, the competent employee, the dutiful daughter, the partner who performs affection with the timing of someone who learned early that love was a test with consequences for failing. The mask holds because it has been holding for so long, the face beneath it growing smooth with disuse, the muscles of authentic expression atrophied from years of strategic deployment. She is not unhappy exactly, because unhappiness would require a standard she no longer possesses, a sense of what life might feel like if she were actually in it rather than observing from the carefully maintained distance that has become her only home. The recognition waits, patient as the childhood that created it, knowing that survival always reveals itself eventually, the strategies that kept her safe becoming the walls that keep her alone. She moves toward it without knowing she is moving, drawn by an exhaustion that has outlasted its purpose, the body finally demanding what the mind has denied, the dangerous, necessary truth of being seen.
If this is already making sense to you, it means you're starting to notice patterns most people never see. Subscribe, and let's keep exploring how the mind really works. Now, this is where things start to get uncomfortable.
The house was not violent in ways that left marks, which made it harder to name later when she tried to explain why she flinched at raised voices that were not angry, why she scanned exits and rooms with locked doors. Her mother moved through the kitchen with the tension that preceded her, the atmosphere shifting before she spoke, so that the child learned to read the air like weather, predicting storms from pressure changes invisible to the untrained eye. There were no rules posted because rules that are spoken can be negotiated, and this family operated on regulations that lived in the mother's face, in the length of the silence that followed a wrong answer, in the withdrawal of warmth that could happen mid-sentence. She learned to watch the eyes for the moment when attention shifted from benign to dangerous. The slight narrowing that meant she had said too much or too little had revealed something that would be used later in ways she could not predict. The father was present as furniture is present, occupying space without altering it, his silence a permission for whatever the mother enacted, his absence of intervention teaching her that protection was not something to expect from men. She developed a timing for disclosure, offering information only when the mother's mood had passed through its dangerous phase, when the chemicals in her brain had settled enough to receive news without weaponizing it. A good grade was celebrated with intensity that felt like hunger, the mother consuming her daughter's achievements as proof of her own worth, so that success became dangerous, something that fed a need that could never be filled. A bad grade was met with a disappointment so profound it felt like mourning, as if the child had died and been replaced by something defective. The silence lasting days until she performed sufficient penance through achievement or illness. She learned to read the mother's body for signs of which self had arrived home. The version who might be pleased by her drawing or the version who would find the colors wrong, the effort insufficient, the child herself too much, and never enough. The brother escaped into anger, his explosions creating a diversion that allowed her to slip further into the background, becoming expert at the art of being present without being noticeable. The child who never caused problems because she had ceased to be a person who could cause anything. Her room became a laboratory for invisibility, the arrangement of objects designed to signal compliance, the bed made with military precision, the toys organized not for play, but for display. Evidence of a childhood she was not actually having. She invented rituals for safety, counting steps between the car and the front door, arranging her words in her mouth before releasing them, studying the faces of adults with the intensity of a linguist learning a language that had no consistent grammar. The mother's love arrived as weather arrives, unpredictable and extreme. The same embrace that comforted on Tuesday becoming suffocating on Wednesday. The child never knowing which version she would encounter, which self she would need to become to survive the encounter. She learned to offer the mother versions of herself, trying each like costumes, until she found the one that produced the least tension. The daughter who asked about the mother's day, who mirrored the mother's opinions, who disappeared as a separate self in order to remain in the room. The cost was not calculated at the time because children do not calculate, they simply adapt. The nervous system wiring itself around survival without consulting the conscious mind about long-term consequences or the possibility of other ways to live. She stopped knowing what she wanted because wanting was dangerous. Revealed preferences becoming leverage. The mother's memory for her daughter's desires exact and strategic, used to reward or withhold depending on the daughter's performance of gratitude. Birthdays were exhibitions of this economy. The gift that proved the mother's devotion followed by the requirement of a reaction that matched the expenditure. The child learning to produce tears of joy on cue. The timing of her pleasure more important than its authenticity. The body recorded what the mind could not afford to know. The stomachaches that preceded visits. The insomnia that followed them. The way her hands shook when the phone rang with the mother's number. The number she had never been allowed not to answer. School became a different kind of theater. The performance of normalcy requiring constant vigilance, watching the other children for cues she had missed, their spontaneous laughter a foreign language she studied without ever achieving fluency. She was not bullied, because she was not visible enough to bully, slipping through the social architecture like a draft through weather stripping, present in body, but absent in the way that mattered, the way that invited connection or its violent opposite. Teachers described her as mature, a child who caused no trouble, who completed assignments with precision, but without the messiness of real engagement, and she felt the praise as confirmation that her strategy was working, that disappearance was the correct path. The body grew while the self remained stunted, developing the physical markers of adolescence without the psychological equipment to manage them. The attention of boys feeling like threat, because all attention had been threat. All visibility requiring defense. She learned to manage this new danger with the same tools, becoming whoever the moment required. The cool girl, the smart girl, the girl who was not like other girls. Each performance exhausting but necessary, each one further from any center she might have possessed. The mother monitored this development with the jealousy disguised as protection, warning her about the intentions of men while touching her own youth, like a wound that had never closed. The daughter's emerging body a mirror the mother could not bear to face. She responded by hiding the body, loose clothes and downcast eyes. The strategy of invisibility adapted to new terrain. The same old calculation that being seen was being targeted, that survival required a self that could not be located. The father remained furniture, his silence now feeling like complicity, his absence of comment on the mother's behavior a permission she could not forgive, even as she replicated it in her own relationships, choosing partners who would not intervene. College offered geography as solution, distance measured in miles that felt like safety. The phone calls manageable because they could be ended, the visits scheduled and therefore survivable, the performance requiring preparation but not constant maintenance. She believed she had escaped. The new city offering reinvention, the chance to become someone who had not been formed by those rooms, those silences, that economy of conditional love, and for a while the belief was sufficient to feel like truth. But the nervous system does not relocate. It travels with the body, the same scanning of rooms, the same calculation of threat in ordinary interactions, the same exhaustion following social events that required only the maintenance of a surface she had learned too well to drop. She found herself attracted to people who replicated the mother's instability, their unpredictability feeling like home, even as it destroyed her, the familiarity of emotional weather more compelling than the strangeness of steady skies. The pattern repeated without her recognition, each relationship a variation on the original theme, her own behavior in them mysterious to her, the way she disappeared when closeness became possible, the way she performed intimacy without feeling it. Therapy offered language for what she had experienced, words like emotional neglect and enmeshment that described without explaining, that gave her a diagnosis but not a cure. The knowledge of origin not sufficient to alter the pattern. She understood that she had been parentified, made responsible for the mother's emotional state, her own needs disappearing into the service of regulating another's, and she could say these things with the detachment of someone discussing weather patterns on another planet. The understanding did not reach the body, which continued its vigilance, its strategic withdrawals, its exhaustion in the face of ordinary demands. The nervous system operating on rules written in childhood and never updated for adult conditions. She saw now the trade-off that had been made, the exchange of authenticity for safety, the self-sacrifice to maintain connection with people who could not tolerate a separate person, who required merger, and called it love. The self she might have been existed only as shadow, a sense of something missing that she could not name, a grief for a childhood she had not been allowed to have. A life spent preparing for dangers that were no longer present. The prison was invisible because it was internal. The bars made of neural pathways reinforced through decades of use, the warden her own nervous system doing what it had been trained to do, protecting her from threats that had expired but remained vivid. She could not simply decide to be different because the self that would decide was itself a product of the conditioning. The observer in her head, just another adaptation, the part that watched her life with the same detachment she had learned in childhood. The origin was not a single event to process and release, but an atmosphere she had breathed for years, the air itself structured around the requirement of her disappearance, so that breathing deeply felt like danger, being full felt like transgression. She understood now why presence felt like exposure, why intimacy triggered the same panic as threat, why her body prepared for fight or flight in situations that called for neither. The nervous system unable to distinguish between then and now. The childhood had ended, but the child remained, vigilant in the corners of her consciousness, ready to perform the old strategies at the first sign of danger. The first hint that love was about to become conditional, that presence was about to be punished. She could not evict this child because the child had saved her. The strategies had worked. She had survived when others might not have. The debt of gratitude mixed with the rage of what had been required, what had been taken, what could never be returned. The origin was not blame but biology. The nervous system doing what nervous systems do, adapting to environment without moral judgment, the child innocent and the parents perhaps innocent too, caught in their own patterns, replicating their own childhoods. But innocence did not mean harmlessness. The damage real regardless of intent. The prison constructed with love, or with neglect, or with the simple inability to see a child as separate, to tolerate the existence of a self that was not an extension of their own. She stood at the window of her adult apartment, looking at a city that had nothing to do with her childhood, and felt the old vigilance operating still, the calculation of threat in the ordinary evening, the preparation for a danger that was no longer external. The origin had become the present, the childhood pattern indistinguishable from her personality, the defense so complete that she could not find what it was defending, the self buried so deep that excavation felt like death. This was the prison she had constructed for her own safety, the walls thick with the mortar of survival, the door locked from inside by hands that had long since forgotten they held the key, or that there was a world beyond the walls worth entering. The recognition of this was not freedom but its beginning, the first crack in the foundation, the suspicion that the safety she had purchased was itself the danger, that survival had become its own threat, that the cell was shrinking around her. She could not yet imagine leaving it, the air outside too thin, the light too bright, the space too open for a body that had learned to breathe only in confined places, to see only in dim light, to exist only in the narrow margin between presence and disappearance. But she knew now that she was inside something, that the exhaustion and the distance and the sense of missing her own life were not character flaws but adaptations, strategies that had outlived their usefulness, a childhood solution to an adult problem. The origin was not destiny, the pattern not permanent, but the work of change was not the work of a moment. It was the work of years, of teaching the nervous system new responses, of building a self where none had been allowed to exist. She would begin where she was, in the prison she had built, with the tools she had, the recognition itself a form of light, faint and insufficient, but real, the first indication that the walls were not the world, that she had been inside something, and might someday find her way out. The dinner party gathers 8 people around a table designed for 6. The intimacy forced by proximity, creating a pressure she feels in her throat before anyone speaks. Her body already calculating exit routes from a room with only one door. She watches the hostess perform hospitality with a desperation that mirrors her own performance of guesthood. Both women engaged in the same invisible labor, the maintenance of atmosphere at the expense of actual connection. The room filled with people who are not quite there. Her partner tells a story she has heard before, and she laughs at the correct moment with the correct intensity. Her timing so precise that no one notices the fraction of a second delay. The gap between his words and her response where something essential has been lost. Across the table, a woman named something she will immediately forget leans forward with genuine interest, asking a question that requires disclosure, and she feels the familiar machinery engage, the sorting of possible answers for optimal safety, the selection of the version that reveals nothing. The conversation moves to politics, and she adopts a position she does not hold, not from conviction but from calculation, the real view too dangerous to expose, too much material for judgment, too distinct from the consensus she has sensed in the room's temperature. She watches herself perform agreement, the nodding, the murmured assent, the careful addition of nuance that signals intelligence without threat, and she feels a contempt for this performance that does not stop her from continuing it. The wine helps, lowering the vigilance enough to feel like relaxation, though she knows this is just another strategy, the chemical assistance for a social function her nervous system cannot manage without pharmaceutical support. The modern solution to an ancient problem. Her partner touches her knee under the table, a signal of solidarity or warning she cannot interpret. Their communication reduced to this coded pressure. The language of intimacy collapsed into gestures that could mean anything or nothing. She notices the man across from her watching with an attention that feels like exposure. His gaze is steady for comfort, and she deploys her standard defense, asking him a question that shifts focus. Watching relief flood his face because he too prefers hiding to being found. The dessert arrives and she concentrates on the mechanics of eating, the fork-to-mouth journey offering a structure for the silence, the chewing providing excuse for not speaking, the swallowing a small death she performs repeatedly until the plate is clean. The hostess suggests a game, and she feels panic rise like temperature, the requirement of spontaneous participation feeling like threat, her mind racing through possible performances, the funny competitor, the gracious loser, the invisible participant who somehow wins. She chooses invisibility, the strategy of her childhood adapted to adult terrain, contributing just enough to avoid notice, her points scored without celebration, her losses accepted without disappointment, the game ending with no one knowing if she enjoyed it or endured it. In the car, her partner asks if she had fun, and she says yes with the same timing she used at 6. The lie so practiced it feels like truth. Or perhaps fun itself has become indistinguishable from the absence of disaster. The evening survived rather than lived. He drives in silence that she fills with observation, commenting on the host's renovation, the quality of the wine, anything but the emptiness she feels expanding in her chest, the hunger for something she cannot name and does not know how to request. At work, the pattern repeats with different costumes, the competent colleague who never quite commits to lunch plans, the team member who contributes without revealing, the presence that is technically present but somehow never fully arrives in the room. Her supervisor calls her reliable, a word that feels like diagnosis, the praise for consistency masking the absence of passion, the recognition that she will not cause problems, will not demand attention, will not become the variable that makes management difficult. She is passed over for the project requiring collaboration, the official reason given as her current workload, the real reason understood by everyone including her, the knowledge that she does not play well with others, that her presence creates a friction no one can name. The friction is real. She knows now, not her imagination, but the actual experience of others, the coldness they feel before she speaks, the sense of being with someone who is not quite there, the discomfort of interaction without the reward of connection. She watches colleagues form alliances she cannot enter, their ease with each other a foreign film without subtitles, the body language of trust and teasing and genuine interest, all of it available to her as performance, but not as feeling. In meetings, she speaks with precision that feels like armor, her insights correct but somehow bloodless, the passion drained from her positions by the same filtering system that keeps her safe, that removes the threat of visibility by removing the visibility itself. Her emails are masterpieces of strategic ambiguity, saying everything and nothing, providing protection against misinterpretation by ensuring no interpretation is possible. The modern equivalent of her childhood silence, the digital version of becoming invisible. The promotion goes to someone less careful, someone who has not learned that visibility attracts correction, and she feels the old mixture of shame and relief, the failure that is also success, the avoidance of a position that would require a self she does not possess. In therapy, she describes her relationships with the detachment of a historian, the series of connections that never quite connected, the partners who complained of her distance, the friends who drifted away without confrontation, the pattern she can see but cannot alter. The therapist suggests that others feel her absence, and she resists this knowledge because it implies responsibility, the recognition that her survival strategy has become her social crime, the very thing that kept her safe now making her unsafe to know. She thinks of the man who loved her and left, his final words about feeling alone in her presence, the accusation that made no sense to her because she had been there, physically present, performing care with the precision of someone who had learned that performance was care. She thinks of the friend who stopped calling, the silence that arrived without explanation, the gradual realization that something had failed without her noticing, the relationship maintained on her end, but somehow not received on the other. The identity-shattering moment comes not as insight but as sensation, standing in a grocery store while watching a stranger laugh with her child, the sound unguarded and therefore terrifying, the recognition that she has never laughed like that, has never been unguarded, has never been known. She is the woman others describe as hard to read, mysterious, cold. The compliments that are actually measurements of distance. The recognition that she does not offer the material required for relationship, the raw substance of a self that could be touched or injured. Modern environments reward this. She sees now the workplace that values reliability over passion, the social media that rewards curation over authenticity, the dating culture that prefers the profile to the person. The entire architecture of contemporary life designed for strategic absence. She is perfectly adapted to a world that has made disconnection profitable. Her childhood survival, the ideal preparation for digital existence. The self as brand, the relationship as transaction, the intimacy as content to be managed and optimized. The reward for her adaptation is isolation disguised as independence, the apartment that feels like safety but functions as cell, the schedule that allows no space for the spontaneous, the body that has forgotten how to be touched without performing being touched. She meets someone new and calculates the timeline of disclosure, the optimal moment to reveal enough to maintain interest without revealing enough to be known. The entire relationship structured around the management of information rather than the exchange of selves. The sex is performance she cannot feel, her body present while her consciousness observes from the distance she has maintained since childhood. The pleasure mechanical, the intimacy theatrical, the other person's satisfaction proof of her competence rather than her connection. They lie in the aftermath with their separate thoughts, the gap between their bodies filled with everything unsaid, the questions honest because answers would require presence, the silence comfortable because it allows the continuation of not being known. She feels the other person drifting towards sleep and envies this surrender, the ability to release consciousness without preparation, to trust the environment enough to become unconscious in it, a luxury her nervous system cannot afford. In the morning, she leaves before the requirement of breakfast conversation, her departure explained by early meetings. She does not have the escape feeling like survival, the relief of solitude indistinguishable from loneliness. The two states merge by decades of practice. The pattern continues because it works, because the alternative feels like death, because being known requires a self she has never been allowed to develop, a presence she cannot sustain, an exposure that her body interprets as threat regardless of her mind's intentions. She is not choosing this. She tells herself, even as she chooses it repeatedly, the automatic nature of the defense making it feel like fate, like character, like simply who she is, the possibility of other choices existing only as theory, not as felt experience. The social world operates around her, people forming bonds she cannot enter, communities she cannot join, causes she cannot commit to. The entire landscape of human connection available as observation, but not as participation. The zoo and the cage indistinguishable from her perspective. She watches others with the longing of someone seeing a foreign country, their ease with each other, a language she has studied without achieving fluency, the basic grammar of trust and vulnerability remaining mysterious, despite her advanced vocabulary of performance. The modern amplification of this pattern is everywhere. She sees now the culture of personal brand and curated disclosure, the entire generation learning what she learned in childhood, that safety lies in strategic absence, that relationship is risk best managed through control. She is ahead of her time, perfectly adapted to a world that is catching up with her damage, the early adopter of a dysfunction now becoming standard, the pioneer of disappearance in an age when everyone is learning to disappear into their devices, their profiles, their managed selves. The recognition does not help because it does not change. The knowledge of pattern not sufficient to alter the pattern. The self-awareness just another layer of performance. The observation of her own observation creating an infinite regression with no exit. She continues, because stopping is not possible. The machinery of survival operating regardless of her understanding. The nervous system doing what it was trained to do, protecting her from a danger that no longer exists with strategies that have become the danger. The social expression of her origin is complete. The childhood solution, now the adult condition. The pattern visible to everyone, including her, and therefore invisible, because visibility without possibility of change is just another form of disappearance. The phone wakes her with notifications she did not request. Each alert a small demand on attention she no longer possesses. The day beginning with the same calculus of response that governed her childhood. Only now the mother is everywhere, in every device, every platform, every algorithm designed to maximize engagement through the exploitation of her nervous system's ancient vigilance. She scrolls through faces, performing happiness with the precision she recognizes from her own mirror. The curated joy indistinguishable from the real, because the real has never been available to her as reference. The entire feed. A confirmation that performance is the only authenticity that matters. That everyone has learned what she learned in childhood. That survival requires strategic absence from one's own experience. The platforms understand her better than she understands herself. The machine learning having identified her pattern of engagement, her preference for content that confirms her isolation, her compulsion to compare her interior with others' exteriors. The algorithm feeding her images of lives more perfect than hers that she consumes with the masochism of someone confirming a negative self-concept she cannot afford to examine. She posts nothing because posting requires a self to present. The blank profile picture, a choice that feels like integrity but functions as invisibility. Her digital absence, the continuation of her physical strategy, the same calculation of threat in a new environment where visibility is permanent and therefore permanently dangerous. The dating app presents options she cannot evaluate, each profile, a performance she recognizes as performance, the impossibility of knowing anyone through curated content, making the entire enterprise feel like a trap, the requirement of self-presentation, feeling like the original wound reopened in digital form. She matches and exchanges messages that say everything and nothing, the banter rehearsed, the questions deflected, the entire interaction designed to maintain possibility without risking actuality, the phone becoming a barrier that feels like protection, the distance it creates indistinguishable from the distance she has always maintained. The video call requires a face she must compose, the camera angle calculated, the lighting adjusted, the performance of presence in a medium that removes presence, her image on the screen looking more real than she feels, the digital self becoming the primary self, because it is the only self that can be controlled. Work has migrated to platforms that monitor her status, the green dot indicating availability, the response time measured, the performance of productivity now continuous and observable. Her childhood strategy of invisibility impossible in an environment that requires constant visibility as proof of value. The Slack channel demands participation. The emoji reaction a substitute for actual response. The thread a simulation of conversation that allows her to appear engaged without being engaged. The digital equivalent of her childhood silence, present in the room without occupying space. Her colleagues exist as profiles she has never met. Their physical bodies, theoretical. The entire company, a collection of curated presentations, the trust that might develop in shared space, impossible to generate through screens, the isolation of remote work, indistinguishable from the isolation she brought to it. The culture celebrates this as flexibility, the elimination of commute and costume, without acknowledging the elimination of boundary between performance and rest. The self now required to be on display in the same space where it might have recovered. The home becoming theater without intermission. She works from her bed because the bed is where she is. The boundary between sleep and waking dissolved. The performance of professional self now continuous with the performance of personal self. No transition between roles. No space where she is not calculating the optimal presentation. The algorithm suggests wellness content, meditation apps and productivity systems, all promising optimization of the self she has never been allowed to know. The solutions offered reinforcing the problem by suggesting that better performance is the answer to the exhaustion of performance. She purchases the app that promises presence, the irony lost on her in her desperation, the guided meditation becoming another task to complete, another metric to track, another way to avoid the actual experience of being present by performing presence for a digital record. The data she generates feeds the machine that understands her, the pattern of her scrolling, her pauses, her returns to content that wounds her, all of it analyzed and used to keep her engaged. The digital environment designed to exploit the same nervous system vulnerability that her childhood created. She is not addicted, she is adapted. The platform having found the frequency of her damage and resonating with it. The intermittent reinforcement of notification and response identical to the conditional love she learned to survive. The digital mother as unpredictable as the original. The cost is not visible because it is the absence of what might have been. The relationships not formed because they could not survive translation to screen. The conversations not had because they required physical presence. The self not developed because development requires environment, and the environment is now digital. She feels this as exhaustion without source. The burnout that is not from work, but from the continuous performance work requires. The mask worn so long it has fused to her face. The digital amplification of her childhood strategy, making the strategy invisible by making it universal. Everyone is performing. She tells herself, the observation accurate, but not comforting. The universality of the dysfunction not making it functional. The knowledge that others suffer not alleviating her own suffering. The collective nature of the damage offering no collective solution. The technology promises connection while delivering its opposite. The design of the interface prioritizing engagement over relationship. The metric of success being time spent, which correlates directly with the absence of satisfaction. The user kept hungry by the very system that promises satiation. She recognizes herself in the documentation of digital natives, the generation raised on screens, having developed the same strategies she developed in childhood, the same calculation of optimal presentation, the same disappearance into performance, the same inability to distinguish between self and avatar. The culture has caught up with her damage, normalized it, monetized it, the economy of attention, requiring exactly the dissociation she perfected, the ability to be present without being present, to engage without feeling, to consume without satisfaction, the ideal consumer produced by the same childhood that produced her. She tries to disconnect and finds the attempt itself mediated by technology, the digital detox app tracking her progress, the wellness influencer selling the solution to the problem they exemplify. The entire ecosystem of recovery just another layer of the system that created the wound. The cage is invisible because it is the air she breathes, the water she swims in, the condition of contemporary existence, so total that imagining outside it feels like imagining death. The possibility of other ways of being theoretical rather than felt. She watches documentaries about indigenous cultures with a longing that feels like grief, not for their specific practices, but for the existence of practices at all. The possibility of culture structured around something other than individual performance, community, that does not require the management of personal brand. The comparison is unfair, she knows, romanticizing what she does not understand, but the longing persists. The sense that somewhere people are known without being curated, that presence might be possible without preparation, that relationship might exist outside the economy of attention. Her phone dies and she feels panic like suffocation, the loss of connection feeling like death, though the connections it maintains are the source of her deathliness. The dependence complete. The possibility of autonomy foreclosed by the very tools that promised liberation. She charges it and watches the screen illuminate with demands, the accumulated notifications, a measure of her absence, the world having continued its performance without her, her temporary disappearance noted only by algorithms that require her return to function optimally. The modern amplification is complete. The childhood solution. Now, the cultural condition. Her personal damage indistinguishable from the general damage. The pattern she developed for survival having become the pattern everyone develops for participation. The exception becoming the rule. She cannot blame the technology, because the technology found her already damaged, the vulnerability pre-existing, the platform simply exploiting what was already there. The amplification of a signal she had been broadcasting since childhood. The frequency of her absence finally matched by an environment that requires exactly that. The safety of her strategy is revealed as the cage it always was. The invisibility that protected her now making her invisible even to herself. the digital environment offering infinite reflection without depth, the mirror of the screen showing her surface without interior, the self becoming image becoming nothing. She stands at the window of her apartment, phone in hand, the city below illuminated by the same blue light that illuminates her face, everyone in their boxes performing their isolation, the collective loneliness so complete it feels like connection, the shared damage mistaken for shared experience. The awareness arrives not as insight, but as sensation, the body knowing before the mind can protect it from knowing, the recognition that she has been preparing for a world that finally arrived, her childhood, the perfect training for digital existence, the damage perfectly adapted to the environment that now rewards it. The cage is not technological but psychological, the technology simply the latest expression of an ancient pattern, the requirement of performance for safety, the substitution of image for self, the disappearance into strategic absence that feels like survival, but functions as death. She cannot yet imagine leaving it, the air outside to thin, the light to bright, the space to open for a body that has learned to breathe only in confined places, to see only in dim light, to exist only in the narrow margin between presence and disappearance. But she knows now that she is inside something, that the exhaustion and the distance and the sense of missing her own life are not character flaws, but adaptations, strategies that have outlived their usefulness, a childhood solution to an adult problem amplified by technology into a cultural condition. The awareness is not comfortable, offers no relief, provides no path forward, only the raw recognition of where she is, what she has become, the prison she has constructed, and the technology has reinforced, the self she might have been, existing only as shadow, as theory, as possibility. She cannot yet feel. She finds the fix-it impulse rising like nausea, the articles bookmarked on nervous system regulation, the therapist's number saved in her phone, the workbook ordered with overnight shipping, all of it arriving with the same urgency that once drove her to perfect the performance she now seeks to dismantle. The impulse is the pattern she sees too late. The same calculation of optimal strategy applied to the problem of having been strategic. The self-improvement project, just another project. The healing becoming performance, the moment it is pursued with the desperation that drove her damage. She reads about attachment styles and recognizes herself with the satisfaction of diagnosis, the label offering containment for what felt like chaos, the explanation becoming excuse, the story of origin becoming reason not to change, because change would require becoming someone without story, without excuse, without the narrative that has become her most intimate companion. The therapist suggests presence and she performs presence, reporting on her progress with the same timing she used for childhood achievements, watching the professional for signs that she is doing this correctly, that her healing is adequate, that she can succeed at the task of no longer needing to succeed. She meditates and counts the minutes until it ends, the observation of her own impatience becoming content for later discussion, the experience itself always already mediated by the self that observes, the watcher never resting, never joining, never becoming the experience it watches. The body confines tension she cannot release because releasing would require surrender, and surrender is not available to a nervous system trained for vigilance. The relaxation feeling like threat, the softening like preparation for impact, the safety of the exercise indistinguishable from danger. She tries to feel her feelings and finds only the performance of feeling, the appropriate facial expression, the convincing sigh, the narrative of emotion without the actual sensation, the body having learned so well to simulate experience that it has forgotten how to have it. The fix-it impulse returns with new packaging, the spiritual teacher promising awakening, the somatic practitioner promising release, the expensive retreat promising transformation, all of it requiring the same currency she has always paid, the currency of performance, the exchange of present effort for future relief that never arrives. She recognizes the pattern and recognition becomes another layer, the awareness of the pattern part of the pattern, the observation of the trap another trap, the infinite regression offering no exit, only the vertigo of watching herself watch herself watch herself, There is no advice to give because advice is what she has always followed. The external instruction substituting for internal knowing. The manual for living replacing the life itself. The guidance she seeks being the guidance that created her. The authority she consults being the authority she needs to outgrow. She tries to trust herself and finds no self to trust. The center empty. The interior a hall of mirrors reflecting performances without source. The question of what she wants answered only by the echo of what she should want. What would be optimal? What would represent progress? The grief arrives without invitation. Not for what happened but for what did not. The childhood of presence she never had. The parents who could not see her. The self that was sacrificed before it could be known. The mourning without object because the losses of something that never existed. She tries to feel this grief and finds the performance of grieving, the appropriate tears, the convincing heaviness, the narrative of loss without the actual losing. The emotion simulated so well she cannot distinguish it from the real. If real even remains as category, the body remembers what the mind denies, the stomachache before the visit, the insomnia after, the hands shaking when the phone rings, the symptoms without story demanding attention she cannot give because attention requires presence and presence is what was taken. She sits with this and sitting becomes another task. The being with becoming doing. The acceptance becoming effort. The surrender becoming strategy. The healing journey becoming the same journey she has always been on. The journey away from away now. Away from this unbearable now. There is no resolution because resolution is what she has always sought. The future orientation that prevents inhabiting the present. The belief that someday she will arrive at a self she can finally be. The destination that recedes with each step toward it. The uncomfortable insight arrives not as comfort, but as further discomfort. The recognition that she will not be cured, that the pattern does not resolve, that the self she sought to find was itself a construction. The search for authenticity just another performance of a self that never existed outside performance. She is not who she thought she was. Not the damaged child, not the survivor, not the seeker, not the wounded healer, not the pattern or the awareness of pattern or the awareness of awareness. All of it language attempting to contain what language cannot touch. What remains when the narratives fall away is not a self, but a sensation. The body breathing in a room, the light changing, the sound of traffic or silence. The ordinary miracle of existence without interpretation, available only in moments when the machinery of selfhood briefly stalls. These moments do not last and cannot be held. The attempt to hold them being the machinery restarting. The observer returning to observation. The story resuming its necessity. The self reconstituting itself from the fragments of what it imagined it might become. She continues because stopping is not possible. The machinery operating regardless of her understanding, the nervous system doing what it was trained to do. The pattern continuing not because she chooses it, but because choice itself is part of the pattern. The freedom she seeks existing outside the framework that frames her seeking. The haunted quality she sought to create in others arrives finally in herself. The recognition that this does not end, that awareness is not liberation, that knowing the cage does not open the cage, that the key was always a story she told herself about keys. She moves through her life with this knowledge embedded like shrapnel. The wound that does not heal because healing would require a self to heal, the self being itself the wound. The attempt to cure the disease of selfhood with more selfhood, the eternal recurrence of her particular suffering. Others look at her and see what they need to see. The competent professional, the distant friend, the partner performing intimacy. The surface maintained with the precision of someone who has learned that surfaces are all that can be maintained. She looks at others and sees the same performance. The universal adaptation to conditions that do not support authenticity. The entire species engaged in the same project of strategic absence. The difference between her and them only the degree of her awareness, which is not necessarily an improvement. The world continues its rotation without her resolution. The sun rising on days she does not know how to live. The requirement of participation without the reward of meaning. The pattern persisting. because it is what is, because alternative has never been available, because the self that would choose differently was never formed. She lies in bed at night and feels the exhaustion that has outlasted its purpose, the vigilance of a child in an adult body, the protection from dangers that expired decades ago, the machinery operating in empty rooms, the defense against attack when no attacker remains. This is the awareness without resolution, the insight that does not transform, the knowledge that changes nothing, the haunting she sought to create in others finally arriving in herself as the recognition that haunting is the condition of consciousness, the ghost being the self that never was. She will wake tomorrow and perform the day, the mask fitting more snugly with each wearing, the face beneath it growing smoother with disuse, the muscles of authentic expression atrophied beyond recovery, the performance becoming indistinguishable from the self it performs. This is not tragedy, because tragedy requires a self to suffer it. The narrative of fall from grace, requiring a grace that was never present. The story of loss requiring possession. The entire structure of meaning dependent on a wholeness that was always projection. What remains is not meaning but persistence. The body continuing its rhythms, the breath entering and leaving. The days accumulating without purpose. The pattern continuing because it continues. The machinery operating because it operates. The haunting being the only home she has ever known. She does not end this because ending requires conclusion, the promise of transformation she can no longer make, the resolution that would be another lie, the comfort that would betray the truth she has finally arrived at, the truth that there is no arrival. The viewer who has followed this far finds themselves in the mirror of her experience, the recognition delayed until now when it is too late for easy extraction, the discomfort embedded, the resolution withheld, the haunting accomplished not by what was said, but by what cannot be said. They will close this and feel the impulse to fix, to heal, to resolve, the same impulse she traced and found to be the pattern itself. The modern compulsion toward optimization that is itself the wound, the attempt to cure the disease of self-improvement with more self-improvement. This impulse will pass or it will not. They will pursue it or they will not. Either way the pattern continues, the machinery of consciousness operating in its own way, the haunting being the condition of awareness, the awareness being the condition of haunting. She remains where she was, where she has always been, in the narrow margin between presence and disappearance, the self and its performance, the wound and its cure, the story and its end. The end that never comes because it was never anywhere but in the telling. The telling stops, but does not conclude. The silence that follows, filled with everything unsaid. The space where meaning might have been offering, only space. The viewer left with themselves as she is left with herself. The mirror finally clear. The reflection finally seen. The seeing being all that remains when everything else has been understood to be defense. What defense protected remains unknown. Perhaps unknowable, perhaps non-existent, the wound being itself the story of wounding, the healing being itself the continuation of wound, the entire structure a house of cards that stands only because no one breathes too near. She breathes. The cards fall. The house was never there, the standing was always falling, the falling being the only truth that persists when performance is recognized as performance, when the mask is seen as mask, when the face beneath it is understood to have been the mask all along. This is the end that is not an end, the resolution that is not resolution, the awareness without comfort that she sought to create, the haunting accomplished in the space where comfort was expected, the gift being the absence of gift, the presence being the absence of presence, the self being the absence of self. She continues, because continuing is what remains, the pattern persisting, the machinery operating, the days accumulating, the performance maintained with the precision that no longer feels like effort, because effort requires a self to exert it, and the self has been seen through, seen as seeing, seen as the final defense against what cannot be defended against. The viewer turns away or does not, finds relief or does not, recognizes themselves or does not. Either way, the pattern continues. The haunting persists. The silence that follows this speaking being the true speaking. The absence that follows this presence being the true presence. The end that is not an end, being the only end available. She is where she has always been, where you have always been, where the pattern continues because it continues, where awareness arrives too late to change what it reveals, where the only comfort is the absence of comfort, where the only truth is the absence of truth, where the only self is the absence of self, where the only ending is this.